Listen for the Easter story from the Gospel of John. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. And then the other disciple, who reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that Jesus must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. But she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I'll take him away." Then Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. And Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I've not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. And we'll end the reading there. Well, you know, when I was a kid, I was a big fan of Saturday morning cartoons. And I know it's hard for children nowadays to understand this, but you see, you couldn't have cartoons just anytime you wanted back then. There wasn't a cartoon channel. There weren't a whole lot of channels, and you didn't get to choose too much what was on them. And so it was just Saturday mornings when I could count on there being a bunch of cartoons, and I waited every week just for Saturday mornings. It was a treat. And as I was thinking about that this week, I also couldn't help but remember how violent most of them were. And it made me think of something I heard the theologian and scholar Walter Wink say one time. He was the one who coined the phrase, the myth of redemptive violence. And he said that redemptive violence is what he called the American civil religion. Yes, sort of the primary religion of America. And he said it's the notion that might makes right. That through violence, we can somehow overcome evil and make things right. And he said Saturday morning was the catechism for that civil religion of the myth of redemptive violence. And there's a lot of truth to it. I look back on it. My favorite one was Popeye. I don't know, some of you are old enough to remember Popeye. But Popeye was this kind of scrawny guy who got beat up by Brutus, his nemesis, all the time. And the whole show, every show would be about Popeye being brutalized by this guy. And my little 8-year-old sense of injustice would just be getting angrier and angrier and saying, do something, do something. And finally, at the end, just when you think Popeye's had it, he would eat his spinach And then all of a sudden his arms, with his little scrawny forearms, would become these clubs, and he would give Brutus the whipping that made the world right again. And I can just remember this almost cathartic religious release I would have every time when Popeye would finally make things right with Brutus. It hit me this week that the Gospels never really made a very good cartoon. You know, I mean, they've tried. You know, and there's been some admirable attempts like Veggie Tales, not actually a cartoon, but some creative attempts to use playful things like that. But in general, it just doesn't fit. The story doesn't lend itself to the climactic, redemptive violence at the end. It's a great story. I mean, when you think about it, it's full of drama. There's heroes, there's villains, there's an amazing plot, there's betrayal, and there probably would have been some good romance if we'd been more honest about the relationship between Jesus and Mary. I mean, it's all there. But it just doesn't end right for an action movie. It occurred to me that Jesus probably wouldn't have made a very good Avenger, because his only superpower was love. And I could just imagine, you know, Iron Man and Thor saying, love, that's all you got? Come on, Wonder Woman. Let's go take on Thanos ourselves. And so I was thinking this week, is love all we got? Is that enough? The year before I became pastor of this congregation, I was contracted to write a bunch of songs for children for a Mennonite curriculum. This was not the horse and buggy Mennonites. Actually a pretty progressive bunch. And one of them needed to be an Easter song. I said, could you write us a new Easter song for kids? And I don't have a lyric video of it. I can't play it for you. But I found myself thinking about that song this week as I asked myself, so what have I got to say? Or more specifically, the preacher's question, which is a prayer, God, what would you like to say this Easter? And I felt that it's important to get back to some of the really simple things, because it's the simple truths of our faith that are so easy to take for granted that are the most powerful and the most healing and hopeful and life-changing and world-changing and transforming when it comes down to it. And I've written a lot of children's music over the years. I love doing that. Number one, it gives me an excuse to be a little silly and playful, and I tend to get way too serious, you know. But it also forces me to take some deep stuff and to try to distill it into something that a 3 to 5 year old can get. And just parenthetically, I often joke that I know the adults in the congregations often get more out of the children's messages because they're just easy to understand and they're pretty straightforward and nice little object lesson. Sometimes we can overthink this whole thing. But so what I decided to do was, what I had to do when I wrote that song for that curriculum was just ask myself, it was a great exercise. So what is the essence of Easter? And here's a chance to say to little kids, here's what Easter means. But they have to do it simply and succinctly. So I decided to make the lyrics of that song the framework for my message today. And it's real simple and quick. There's 4 verses, but they're just 2 sentences each. The chorus, the refrain of the song says, God raised Jesus on Easter Day. What does that mean for us today? Here's the first verse. It means all that Jesus stood for as he lived and taught God's way was proclaimed as true forever when Christ rose on Easter Day. You know, Jesus did not just come to die for us. And if that's all we've got, when someone says, why did Jesus come? If the only answer we've got is, well, to die for our sins, we haven't really thought about it deeply, let alone engaged with it deeply. Because I would say Jesus came to live for us and with us and to show us what a life full of the Spirit of God, completely yielded to God's Spirit, to show us what that looks like, so that we would also embrace the same level of commitment. But so all of his teachings about greatness in God's eyes being about serving people with love and humility, about mercy and kindness and truth and compassion for the poor and forgiveness and justice and extravagant welcome, about trusting God above everything, about looking at creation and taking our cues from how to live from things like the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. When Christ rose, among other things, that was God's way of, in a sense, validating and vindicating, if you will, everything Jesus stood for. And I've often shared with you that the roots of the word sin actually come from archery. And hamartia is the Greek word for anybody who wants to look it up. And it was about missing the mark, about not having true aim. And so Jesus came to get our aim right. Sin isn't so much about being wrong morally as it is about what doesn't work when it comes to living life joyfully and fully and meaningfully. So, if you want to get your aim true, look at Jesus. The second verse, so let me go back. God raised Jesus on Easter Day. What does that mean for us today? Second verse, it means this world's hate and violence never will be strong enough to somehow keep Jesus silent. The last word will be God's love. Actually chokes me up a little bit because, I was thinking, if I had a nickel for every time someone has said something along the lines of, love, is that all you got? Or more specifically, hey, you can only take this God's love stuff so far. I mean, in the real world, there are people who will eat that love for breakfast. And people who only understand the language of violence. You can't talk love to them. They will overcome you. They will do away with you and enjoy it. Jesus was not naive. He was not an airy-fairy dreamer, somehow separated from the so-called real world. And that's why one of his most recurring teachings was, look, the first are going to be last. The last are going to be first. In other words, you guys have this whole thing upside down. Do you realize that? In so many ways. And so part of what he was all about was reminding us of what reality, capital R, is truly about. And when it came to violence, not only did he experience it, he stared Pilate down. And the powers of the empire, he stared them down, knowing full well that they would kill him. And so Easter means that you can't kill the truth. You can't kill love. You can kill somebody who embodies it. But truth lived out in love is the only power strong enough to overcome and ultimately transform all the relative powers of evil and death in this world. Impressive and consequential as they may be, their days are numbered. And it's the people who have truly gotten that, and who has risked their lives being true to that, who have transformed history the most. Jesus, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela. And this is why in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant." The third verse, and this one's actually my favorite, it says, "It means when we lose our laughter, God can bring joy back again. God can always write new chapters and change how the story ends." So that means that when we are in the midst of something painful, and I'm talking about the worst things, like a pandemic, like losing your job, like seeing the business that you've worked so hard to make successful begin to evaporate with no guarantee that it ever gets back on track. Like our own most painful and personal losses and heartbreaks. Like struggles with our own mental health, anxiety, depression, diminished capacity to think as clearly or sharply as we used to, or to be able to remember things. Whatever it might be, right in the midst of what's most painful and frightening and frustrating and devastating, Easter means that the story we're in right now is not over. In fact, Easter means that God will see to it, sometimes in and through the efforts of people willing to do the work, that the end of the story is love, is coming home. These aren't just cheap words. These are expressions of the truth that makes all the difference in the world. Right now, in ways so beautiful we can't even imagine it, our personal and our collective histories are actually moving toward love, capital L. I know it's hard to see it. It's hard to feel it or believe it sometimes. But that's when we need to know it most deeply. Because if you can know, right when you're in the midst of the most difficult thing, even when you have the best reasons to hate or despair or resent or check out, numb out, give up, if you can know then that God is real, that God is with you, and that though God is most likely not causing this, God will use this, even this, to take me, you, more deeply into the essence of love. Well, that's when anxiety and fear get converted. Nadia Bolz-Weber said in a sermon recently, anxiety converted is hope. We have hope because God is writing new chapters right now. And what's incredible is that you and I sometimes get even to be the brush or the pencil in God's hand with which God writes and creates. Last verse. It means God's way of salvation is now clear for us to see. It means all of us are welcome to receive God's grace and peace. Now, you see, I had to get the word salvation in the song because this was for the Mennonites, and they're a little bigger on that word than I tend to be. I don't use the word salvation as beautifully and biblical as a word, beautiful and biblical of a word as it is. I don't use it a lot because I'm not big on the notion of engaging the divine as being a way to get saved from hellfire or to somehow get spared the trial. And the buzzword, are you saved? Too often has rubbed me and many people the wrong way. But salvation is a beautiful word. Its root is the same root as the word salve, as in a healing balm. So salvation, God's salvation, is about healing. It's about the ultimate healing of all people, all diseases in the long run, and even creation itself. God will help us overcome this pandemic. But the real salvation might be about what we do with this opportunity to stop business as usual on so many levels and to reevaluate and make some new choices that just might lead to a deeper healing for this world. And the last line, that all of us are welcome to receive God's grace and peace. Well, all means all. This just reminds me, I forgot to ask Helen to read our opening paragraph today, but we're big on all meaning all in our congregation and in the United Church of Christ, that all people are welcome. The love and truth that are stronger than death, that we celebrate every week and every day as followers of Jesus, is for everyone and everything, all races, all religions, Jews, Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus, yogis, Jainists, Taoists, atheists, agnostics, gay, straight, trans, good people, lost people, kind people, not so kind people, introverts, extroverts, all the Myers-Briggs types and all the Enneagram types, Americans, Russians, capitalists, socialists, communists, the people you like and the people you don't like. You get the point? Everybody's in. What a beautiful, indiscriminate, scandalous love. You don't earn this. Everybody receives the grace and the goodness of God, whether we like it or not. Personally, I love it. I thank God for the gift it is to be alive right now, and for the promise that life goes on no matter what for all of us. And for those who might be facing the actual end of life right now, the promise of resurrection is the promise to all of us that life goes on. And I believe the biblical message is that God's grace is so incredible that every one of us will have a fantastic, beautiful end or new beginning to our own personal histories when life in this body ends. And if anything I've just said troubles you, if you came from a tradition that would say otherwise, well, contact me and I'll make the biblical case for you, okay? One of which, though, is Jesus saying to the cross, or to the thief on the cross next to him, today you'll be with me in paradise. There was no doctrine quiz. He didn't ask him if he believed in him first. I will close with something that the woman who led me to Jesus when I was 17, said to me that summer after my junior year in high school. I started reading the Bible, and I was blown away by the teachings of Jesus. And she said to me one day, she just said, hey, you're obviously really interested in this. You obviously are learning about Jesus. Why don't you talk to him? I said, what do you mean? She said, well, if the Easter story is true, he's still alive, We'll set aside all the wonderful theological discussions about the difference between Jesus of Nazareth and the cosmic Christ another time, folks. In some mysterious way, Jesus Christ is still with us, alive. In such an incredible way that he's with you right where you are, in your living room or wherever it is you're holding up during this pandemic. Christ is here in this sanctuary where I miss you as I look at the empty seats. Christ is with every healthcare worker, masked up, suited up, trying to stay alive. Every person wondering if they're in the process of reaching the end. Christ is everywhere, with all of us, meeting us in our suffering and reminding us that love will ever be stronger than death. That's good news. Happy Easter.